So with no further delay, I'd like to turn the floor over to our presenter tonight, Michael Joseph Roberto, who was an associate professor of political science, I believe, at North Carolina A&T, an HBCU, historically Black institution of higher learning in North Carolina. Two hurrahs for that, I guess, three hurrahs even. So he wrote the book, The Coming of the American Behemoth, and he was also a journalist, and now he says that he wants to be known as a musician and a writer. So with no further delay, I turn the mic over to Dr. Roberto.
Thank you very much, Dee. Thank you, all of you, to the CPUSA, to the Educational Committee for inviting me tonight. As Dee said, I would like to keep my remarks to no more than 30 minutes so we can really have discussion. So, as Dee said, I wrote this book, and it was published in the end of 2018. It was published by Monthly Review Press, and I'd like to thank Monthly Review Press for publishing my book. And I want to thank my editor, Michael Yates, and Martin Patio, who is the business manager and a very dear friend and really solid comrade. And I'd like to, well, I can't do this. I'd like if you buy the book, please buy the book. I make $1.30 for every copy. The top illustration, which is the American Behemoth, was done by my son, Nate Roberto, who's a very fine artist in his own right. And this book could not have been written without the most competent editorial assistance of my wife, Sharon K. Weber. So, American Behemoth, the coming of the American Behemoth, the origins of fascism in the United States, 1920 to 1940. This book, believe it or not, which I consider a primer. I think I state that in the preface. What is a primer? A primer means it's an introduction into a discourse that must be had, that is long overdue. This is the first that I know of, a comprehensive treatment of the question of fascism historically in the United States, since many of you who are in attendance tonight, your wonderful predecessors, who in 1938 wrote the only, until my book, the only comprehensive treatment of fascism, The Peril of Fascism, which was written by A.B. McGill and Henry Stevens, but Henry Stevens was a nom de guerre, and there have been some speculation. Anyway, we certainly know who A.B. McGill was, and this book was foundational to my book, because it is one of what I call the forgotten voices of the 1930s and the 1940s, who understood the national particular character of fascism, understood American fascism distinct from German fascism, Italian fascism, European fascism, and whatever other manifestations that seem to be indicative of what both Miguel and Stevens called in 1938 the mechanism of repression of fascism, and also defined fascism. Defined fascism in the following way. They said that fascism was not going to look like Italian fascism or German fascism. It would look utterly American. This is page 118, chapter 5, Big Business, Fountainhead of Fascism. We have examined the general trends and forces behind the fascist danger in the United States. We now turn to the specific fascist and semi-fascist organizations and movements which threaten American democracy. To discover the fountainhead of these movements, one must look to the dominant finance capitalist groups. The scattered streams and trickles of developing American fascism have a common source: Wall Street. Magel and Stevens were part of a discourse that had emerged by 1934. I have before me several books. This one, Do We Want Fascism?, written by a woman named Carmen Heider, who had a PhD in history from Columbia University, went to Italy in 1922, came back, published a book called Capital and Labor in Italy, and 4 years later published this book when she was working for the Brookings Institution and had taken herself around the country to some extent. And she wrote this incredible book, Do We Want Fascism? She pretty much said the same thing that this fellow, Moritz Hallgren, who was not a member of the Communist Party, and neither was Carmen Heider, although they were both Marxists in their treatment of fascism. This is what Hallgren wrote in 1933, the end of 1933, before it appeared before Carmen Heider's book. Hallgren was a journalist who wrote for The Nation, wrote for a number of left publications, and then toward the end of his career went mainstream, and I think finished his career as a columnist, editorial writer for the Baltimore Sun, I think what it was. Anyway, this is what he wrote. What is fascism? There has been much confusion of thought and opinion concerning the meaning of this term. Radical students have applied it to the growing economic power of the monopolists. Others, with Mussolini and Hitler in mind, identify fascism with dictatorship. Still others look upon fascism as a popular political movement, as revolutionary, or even socialistic. The growth of monopoly capitalism is, of course, the principal element in the making of fascism, and there can be little doubt that the fascist state is a dictatorial state. Fascism may appear to be the outgrowth of a popular movement, for under some circumstances, the support of the people is necessary to its proper development. It was so in Germany, for example, though not in Italy. Nor can fascism be considered either revolutionary or socialistic, though it apparently contains a few elements of both. For accurately speaking, fascism is a political philosophy based upon the need of capitalism to employ the power of the state to protect the institution of production for private profit. No better definition from somebody who thought, like a Marxist, understood what was happening in the moment. I look to my right here, and I'm looking at a half a dozen key books that, again, were part of the forgotten voices. Most important, and are these 2 books, by a man who was a founder of the Communist Party in this country, and then was framed for some ridiculous thing in the early 20s, then came back and changed his name from Louis Freina to Louis Corey, and wrote this thing, The Decline of American Capitalism in 1934. And I won't even begin to tell you how important this book is. So important that historians have, for the most part, ignored it, especially and starting with Arthur Schlesinger, who said the most ridiculous things about this book, even after a reviewer for the Wall Street Journal said that this book could not be ignored because of its comprehensive analysis of capitalism, capitalist crisis, and the danger of fascism. The Wall Street Journal acknowledged brilliance when Arthur Schlesinger, because he was a Cold War historian, could do what most historians, political scientists, and others have done since, which is to ignore, distort, or trivialize this wonderful seedbed of learning that is so crucial to all of us, working people, to the working class in this moment. Louis Corey, the other great book, The Crisis of the Middle Class. And I hope some questions come up about the role of the middle class when we get to that. Let me check my time. Okay, I'm doing pretty well. So, how do I define fascism? Not in any way that I would claim to be original. I wrote it down a couple of days ago, walking around, playing the congas, practicing, figuring out how to make sense of all this stuff, how to boil it all down. How do I define fascism in the current moment, historically and theoretically, as a Marxist, as a communist, hopefully? It is the rule of finance capital in all its forms, which are derived from myriad processes, fascist processes. In my book, I call fascist processes all those that extend the control and domination of capital over society, its political institutions, and mass consciousness. I go further by hopefully not distorting a very important conceptual tool in Herbert Marcuse's One-Dimensional Man, where he, at the very beginning of the book, he talks about two kinds of processes that are terrorist and non-terrorist in modern industrial society. And of course, he's writing from a perspective of the Frankfurt School, where and he's writing, he's doing critical analysis of both American capitalism and Soviet communism. And so we all know this. But anyway, from Marcuse, I got terrorist and non-terrorist processes. And I think I successfully used that construct to argue that when I say that it is the rule of finance capital in all its forms, which are derived from myriad processes, these processes are terrorist and non-terrorist. Going back to A.B. McGill and Henry Stevens in 1938, what they were looking at is what was happening to them, but they were theorizing it because they were communists. They were living in the moment, but they were building. They were as communists. They were in line with Dimitrov's definition presented to the Comintern in 1935. And what came out of that, as we know, United Front, was actually something that Browder and the CPUSA helped to bring into the discussion, because the European factions were still caught up in, I think, the so-called third period. You know, and the SPD in Germany, they were social fascists. I don't want to get off the track here. So let me come back to my main point, which is that fascism in America from the start, unlike Germany, unlike Italy, was built on the foundation of both terrorist and non-terrorist processes, beginning in the early 1920s, in the aftermath of World War I, when, for historical reasons, America became the world's leading creditor, surpassing Great Britain, the world's banker, the great boom of the 20s. It is so theoretically, what we have to examine now is even more challenging than what the CPUSA or anyone else outside of the party or the fellow travelers, like Henry Ward, not Henry Ward, Harry F. Ward, who was the first fellow traveler and was at Union Theological Seminary and a Baptist minister and a lawyer, and he wrote very important stuff. So, I mean, there was this discourse coming together, but it was primarily focused on the terrorist aspects, the mechanisms of repression. Well, we've had so much to look at historically since that time. And when you read my book, hopefully, because I can't discuss so many aspects, this is nothing more than an entry point into not only a discussion of the book, but a discussion of fascism in general, which is absolutely essential. We begin then to understand the more complex, very deep philosophical, psychological dimensions of fascism when defined as the rule of finance power, because it is fundamentally about the marketplace. It is fundamentally about consumerism, surpassing, destroying citizenship, which is what some people have discussed very clearly and deeply, who are not necessarily Marxists. Like, I owe a great deal to Stuart Ewan's PR, because when he looks at this period, he's looking at the power of the market, and it's from Stuart Ewan where I was able to understand the non-terrorist processes in a way in which it's about the market, it's about advertising, it's about public relations, it's about creating this spectacle in the 20s that compels people to want to participate in the spectacle. And it's capitalist progress. It's growth with some at the top and a whole bunch at the bottom. And again, this is part of the history. The depression of the 30s is something that Louis Corey said was going to happen because its seeds were based in the bloom of the 20s, and he uses Marx, chapter 25 of volume 1, the general law of capitalist accumulation. And he applies it beautifully, the only person who's ever done it. So, as I get toward the end of my wrap here, there's the theoretical dimension here. What is fascism? And there's the historical dimension from which the theoretical understanding is derived. And so, number 2, historically, what is fascism? It is the march toward global fascism in this moment, which the Trump presidency was pivotal in making, because this is a global paradigm. It's a global paradigm of competing fascisms and variations of state capitalism. And I think all of it is the result of the failure of socialist transition worldwide after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. We are living in a watershed, much like the period between the end of the Middle Ages in Europe and the beginning of the early modern period, from which we also get the origins of capitalism, the creation of the Atlantic economy, and as Wallerstein so ably demonstrated in his multi-volume work of the world capitalist system, what we have is the beginning of the capitalist system in the 16th century. What we have now is the end game of capitalism. Now, I'll end with this, because in December, this magazine, Melody und Rhythmus, which I understand, I don't know because I'm ignorant of these things, but I was told that this magazine is somewhat the equivalent, the German equivalent of Rolling Stone magazine, and it's very hot as a musician. I love it. But they published a piece by me that I couldn't get published in this country. There it is. Here, it's in German, and it's called in the title in English. Now in German here is "The Masquerade of American Fascism: Capitalist Dictatorship at the Top, Anarchy and Psychosis at the Bottom." That's my title. But look at what they put up at the top. Endspiel. What does Endspiel mean? It means end game. And as one of my very fine friends, who is fluent in German, something I'm not, said in the context of this piece, he thought that they probably also meant end game, but also last round. Last round of what? The last round of finance capitalism. And the last round is brutal, terrorist, it is non-terrorist, it is directed against our humanity, it is directed against our species, and it is directed against the earth itself. Because as Marx says in volume 1 of Capital, I think at the end of chapter 25, he says, capital's like a monster. It devours everything in its place. Everything. And this is what we must fight. And I fear that there aren't enough of us who have the understanding of the history that has been forgotten for whatever reason, and now must be recovered. And that's why I wrote The Coming of the American Behemoth. Thank you very much. I guess
Okay.
question.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Roberto. We'll now open the floor for questions and comments. If you'd like to introduce a question or make a comment, you click the picture of the hand on your control panel, and we will open your mic on our end. You have to use your mouse cursor to open your mic on your end. Just put your mouse cursor over the picture of the mic. But first, if you want to make a question, introduce a question or make a comment, then click your raised hand icon, click the picture of the hand, and we will open your mic. So looking for comments or questions. Laura, your mic is open. Open your mic. Yeah, there you are.
Hi. Yeah, thank you. A couple of years ago, I had a conversation with someone, another peace activist, who insisted we were living in fascism. Oh, this is actually just before Trump was elected. She insisted we were living in fascism about 4 years ago, and I was arguing against that. Was I wrong?
That's a great question. I think I don't think it's a question of right or wrong. I think my view is that we were clearly headed toward a fascist trajectory, and Trump's election did represent that. So I hope I hope I answer your question. I mean, that's how I see it. I can't, because you know, it's interesting. It's Laura, right? You can't see this, but this is an article that was published in 2008 by Gregory Meyerson and myself, and it's called Fascism and the Crisis of Pax Americana. And it was published in a special issue of the journal Socialism and Democracy. And basically what we were arguing was that fashion, we were headed, here's where we both defined fascist process. We talked about fascist processes, and we took the term from Pem Buck, and that was Greg's doing. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is, anyone who began to study fascism the way Greg and I did as Marxists, beginning in 2006, we published an essay in Monthly Review Online, then we published this, and then we published this thing called Moment of Transition, Structural Crisis in the Case for a Democratic Socialist Party. Meyerson, myself, and two Canadians, Jamie Essex and Jeff Noonan, and we discuss the danger of fascism here, which is why we saw the absolute necessity of discussing democratic socialist transition. How did that differ from communist transition? Unfortunately, nobody paid any attention to this either. So all attempts to get serious discussion off the ground have been going on for quite some time by Meyerson and myself principally. And we ran into a lot of opposition from many Marxists, which is not to say we didn't get cooperation. We got published. I have to thank Victor Wallace that journal, Socialism and Democracy, for being really more open and tolerant than a whole lot of other Marxists were toward this. I mean, people, even Marxists or self-proclaimed Marxists, knew about this discourse to some extent, but not at all sympathetic, because they continued to see fascism primarily as a movement as opposed to a function of capital itself. And therein lies the problem now more than ever, because I have here 4 or 5 books that have been published in the last couple of years since my book. One is on fascism, a brief history of fascist lies, how fascism works, American Nightmare, Fascism Old and New, American Politics in the Crossroads. Actually, that one came out before mine. None of these books pay any attention to, they don't even know who A.B. McGill and Henry Stevens was. They have no idea who Carmen Hyder was. So this is a very long drawn out to your question. You were right, so was the other person. It doesn't matter, because these were fascist processes that became a full-blown fascist trajectory with Trump. And the problem is now, the big problem is now that the mainstream media is not even willing to entertain the idea of Trump as a fascist. They don't want to talk about fascism, and when they do it in such simplistic terms. It's ridiculous. A long answer to a very good question. I hope I shed some light on it.
Okay, Dave, your mic is open. Please open your mic on your end. There you are.
Okay, hey, thank you, Professor. Yes, 2 questions actually. One is about the middle class myth. Why is it that liberals, for the most part, never connect working with class? It's always middle class this, middle class that. Bernie Sanders is one of the very few that actually say working class. And I think that this myth of the working class just works to prevent working class consciousness. And question number 2 is, where can we find your book, your article, your Endspiel article in English translation? Thank you.
Let me, is it David? Yeah. Let me answer the second question. I'm sorry. Did I get your name right?
Yes, it's Dave.
Dave, okay, yes. Dave, let me answer the second question first, because it's easy. There is no official English translation of Endspiel. I will get it up on my webpage as soon as I possibly can. I only got clearance from the editors last week that they told me there was no official translation and that I could post what I had sent to them. They made very few changes. Just don't make any reference when I post it to their thing. I don't know. But, you know, if you go, give me a chance to get it up, and all you need to do is go to michaeljosephroberto.com, and it should be up there at some point. As far as the other essays are concerned, the two most, the Fascism and the Crisis of Pax Americana, that was in Socialism and Democracy in 2008. Moment of Transition was published online first in the Journal of Cultural Logic in 2010, and then it was published in a print journal called Works and Days a couple of years later. If you really want it, I've got some of these, and I'd be more than happy to send it to you, so we can figure that out. So that was the second question. The first question, liberals. Man, I've had it with liberalism. I've had it with liberalism theoretically, historically, personally, emotionally, to the point where I think the problem in this country right now is not so much the massive disorganized working class, people just trying to survive, just meted out every day, but the 9.9% below the 0.01%, the enlightened ones, the people who hated Trump but leveraged their own personal portfolios on Wall Street. The hypocrisy of the middle class knows no bounds. Louis Corey had it right in 1935. I mean, I don't know what to say, Dave, except that if we can cut through our own problem of the middle class in our own cities, towns, communities, and I say that guardedly because this is not something that can be done in New York or Boston or Chicago or LA. I think this is something that can be done in second and third tier cities, especially after the Biden-Harris stimulus program does nothing more than get us through 6 months. And then we'll have the same situation that Roosevelt faced in 1934 when the New Deal had stalled and there was labor militancy. And Huey Long, who was Trump's predecessor, was making his bid, and it was only the assassin's bullet that stopped the man who Roosevelt thought was the most dangerous in America. He and General MacArthur, you know, who had led the charge against the bonus marchers. The liberals cannot part with the market. They can't. I mean, in the 30s, when Corey was talking about the crisis of the middle class, I mean, it was obvious to Corey that the middle class, and the same thing was true for Maurice Halgren, Seeds of Revolt. He understood what had happened to the middle class, especially the lower middle class, as a result of the Depression. And Halgren said, the working class didn't lose; they didn't gain from the boom in the 20s. It was the middle class and the lower middle class, and that was the class that got Roosevelt elected. And after 100 days of reorganizing the American economy to make it even more state capitalist, it still wasn't enough. We know what happened in 37. We had a recession within the Depression, and then Roosevelt turned finally toward Keynesianism, or what his own Federal Reserve chair, Mariner Eccles, had called even before Keynes had said in 1936 in his book. Eccles said, we need the government must function so as a way of providing a compensatory economy. In other words, the government must do this. Well, Roosevelt did it in 1938, restored funding, but then, so Roosevelt goes toward Keynesianism, but it's military Keynesianism. The thing is, the middle class doesn't understand any of this and doesn't want to, because the middle class is educated by the Schlesingers, by the Leuchtenbergs, by the greats. And, you know, the middle class talks the talk, but can't walk the walk. This is a very difficult question for me because I really worked very hard to attempt to get Sanders to do something here in North Carolina, both times. And the main problem with getting Sanders here, the main problem with building something here to get Sanders here, were activists who were not working class in their thinking. in their thinking. In other words, they were not Marxists. And in Greensboro, North Carolina, where I'm from, the communists were not communists. The communists had become liberals. And the worst anti-communism that I have experienced and I've read about, and actually some of these great people who are the forgotten voices, they turned, they turned into their opposites. As much as they understood things, they turned into their opposites. Why? Because they were connected to the Comintern, and because of what happened in 1939 with the Steel Pact and the flipping and the flopping. Can I say, this has had a most deleterious impact on the education of the middle class, which I now believe as a class has fallen victim to what the Renaissance humanists called docta ignorantia, learned ignorance. And I brought that up a couple of times to some middle class friends and family. And I felt like Savonarola, yes, and it was burned at the stake. I hope I answered your question, sir.
Okay, Kat, your mic is open. Open your mic on your end. Put your mouse, there you are.
Hi, thank you, Professor, for the talk. I was just wondering if there's a German theorist from the East called Kurt Gosweiler, who talked a lot about monopoly factions and in his history of German fascism, and how it was the old industries like IG Farben and steel that were the most.
Yes, I just became aware
reactionary. And I haven't read your book yet, and I apologize for that. It's hard to get books in New Zealand. You have to kind of wait 2 months for them to ship it over. But I was wondering if both in the 30s or in the present, you'd identified kind of if there were any sections of American monopoly capital that had kind of ultra-reactionary or fascist tendencies more than the others, like how steel and the biochemistry played in Germany.
I didn't catch, can you repeat the last part of that question? I did not get that. It was a very good question. It's very complex.
Are you talking about? Just, Kat, if you could restate the tendencies you're talking about.
Yes. So within American monopoly capital, either in the 1930s or in the present, are there specific industries or blocks of monopoly capital which have a more kind of reactionary or fascist tendency within US politics?
Actually, okay, let me answer this as best as I can. And the answer will not necessarily correspond to the question unless you sort of think about the connections that I'm trying to make. I watch Bloomberg a lot. And it's interesting, toward several months ago, I started to get this distinct sense that the second tier capitalists who are primarily involved in production were complaining bitterly about being strangled by finance. So I guess, that's where I would start to attempt to answer your question. I mean, look, Amazon is Amazon. I mean, what is it? It's like our equivalent of the Goering enterprise. I mean, I call my book the American Behemoth because it's talking about Germany. I mean, Franz Neumann's treatment of National Socialism in 1943 is just cannot be. Anyone who ignores this book and thinks he or she knows something about fascism needs to look in the mirror. What he says here is that by the time Gleichschaltung, the fascist reordering, is complete, the Goering Works has become what Amazon is now to the American consumer. Yikes. Makes me want to run. So I think it's a great question. I think the question needs to be, I think that would be a great question for an article in one of the left journals that I used to subscribe to, because I just can't read any more Marxist scholasticism in the face of all this horror and death and misery here, and wondering that the only way we got out of the first general crisis of American capitalism was a war against fascism elsewhere, and now we have competing fascisms and variations of state capitalism, and what we don't have globally, except in our minds and our hearts, is the socialist alternative. Unless you read one of these damn journals, then I guess you feel pretty good about how things are going. I don't get that. I get more from that. You see those? I get more from that, because that is the beat of the people, I hope. I mean, now I'm going off. So I'll stop.
Jaime, your mic is open. Jaime, your mic is open.
Let me see if I can open it.
Quickly, please.
Go
I
on.
can play a little bit if you're trying to figure out. No, I'm only kidding. My hands are sore.
If you have a comment or a question, please. Your mic is open.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah,
Oh,
go
okay.
ahead,
I was
man.
looking for. Okay, I'm sorry. I apologize for the delay.
That's okay. That's okay. Go ahead.
I wanted for the good doctor to discuss a little bit further the non-terrorist processes and how those processes manifest themselves in U.S. culture.
Okay.
Can you?
What's your first name again? I didn't get it.
Jaime.
Jaime.
Right. That's
Okay.
cool.
Yeah. Here's a dumb answer. Okay. Because this is how all of this stuff has hit me and reduced me to something that requires that I play. You watch CNN and they're talking about the number. I mean, now fortunately it's different. It's changing. Things are improving. Okay. But 2 months ago, and when I was still in Boston was a horrible, horrible, geez. I mean, I went to school in Boston in the 70s. I've been back. Boston is a dying city for any number of reasons. So you're walking around, you're checking this stuff out. Everybody's got masks on, or the people you do see in the streets. I mean, it's all very weird. It's like a ghost town. And so you're indoors, you turn on CNN, okay? You get, people are dying. And once you turn on Fox, people are dying. You go back to CNN, and you just glued at CNN, and there's all this misery. Then the commercials start. Iced tea, Car Shield. Car Shield. Damn. Then all the pharmaceuticals and stuff. I mean, that's why millions of people don't watch TV. I guess. I don't know, but it's just to the point where, to me, it's just I don't, and I'm sure millions of people feel just the way I do, but you see, we're turned off to it, but we don't see, we don't understand how the spectacle, which was created in the 1920s during the Great Boom, the archetypal capitalist spectacle. I mean, I write about it in my book, or try to capture it anyway. I mean, people's minds were blown. The 1920s was mind-blowing. It was mind-blowing in a horrible way. It was the rise of the Klan, Second Klan, 1920 to 1925. It's, your question is a difficult one, because what we have to come to terms with is something I'm trying to wrap my head around as I begin working on another book on fascism. I didn't want to write this book, I'm working on a new book, and I have a chapter called The Fascist Mindset. Now, what is the fascist mindset? This book, which all therapists should read in this country, Fascism and Democracy in the Human Mind. It was published, IW China. This is a university press book, and this guy was a serious guy. He was the director of the Holocaust Museum, and then he got a PhD in psychology, and now he's a practicing psychologist. And you know, so this is the thing. What is the fascist mind? The fascist mind is the closed mind. What is the democratic mind? The democratic mind is the open mind. What allows us to remain open-minded when non-terrorist fascist processes aimed at the domination of capital over every aspect of our lives is so pervasive that it requires grasping it. Now, I think as the crisis deepens, the objective conditions arise for this kind of transformation in people's thinking. But who's going to do it? Simple question, simple answer. The communists. Where are the communists? I mean, you can't see it. To the left of Lenin is Marx and Engels, volume 6, you know, in the collected works, the manifesto, part 4 of the manifesto. What did the communists do? They unite. They unite with the working class in its momentary struggles, but always with, I forget what words are used, but always with the vision, always with an understanding, with a grasp of what must be in the future. And we're not doing that. And the reason why we're not doing it is, despite the terrorist attacks, and despite the fact that millions of people who are white, in addition to the millions more of people of color, African Americans at the top, how can we fight these processes when we're trying to survive? And capitalism, these processes tend toward fragmentation and individualism and the privatization of the mind. It's enough to make somebody give up. And a lot of people have. And a lot of people haven't.
Okay, we have time for just one more question. Taryn, your mic is open. Please open your mic on your end, Taryn.
Professor Roberto, it's so nice to have seen this presentation, and I really appreciate all of the insights that you've given us. And maybe to close off on a somewhat hopeful note, I wanted to know where you think the most valuable front is to be fought right now in this moment, in a post-Trump Biden presidency, in a pandemic. Where do you feel like communists might exert their energy in a useful way? Is it on the cultural front? Is it on the labor front? Is it on the electoral front? Like, what do you see as being a good mass initiative right now to sort of begin to build a base to fight back against this kind of emergent fascism? But thank you so much again for your presentation.
Thank you very much for this is a great question. Let me end as coherently as I can. I think as a Marxist, the concept of totality is what governs me in the struggle against fascism, which is necessary for any possibility of a socialist transition. That said, I don't think we make those divisions between culture and over political struggle or whatever, because I think where we must hold it down and build anew is in our communities, in our cities. Now, again, if you're in a big city that's an international city like New York, or a city like Boston that has its own weird features, as opposed to a city like mine, Greensboro, North Carolina, or a city like Minneapolis, or a city like Memphis. I mean, we create our vision of what we want and what we need based on what is. And so we take what is and we figure out how to create what ought to be. And we remember, as Marxists, as communists, we're always governed by the concept of totality. And let me say this too, in closing. I really believe in the power of loving someone. Let me say, at the risk of seeming ridiculous, that a true revolutionary is guided by great feelings of love. Thank you for your question.
Did Shay say that?
Yes.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Roberto. Thank you for joining us. And you mentioned while we were setting up that you don't belong to any particular organization now. So I think we would like to extend an invitation to you to at least be a friend of ours, if not more. And so we thank you for participating with us tonight. And we hope that there will be occasions for us to interact more deeply in the future.
I hope so too. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and I thank you all for your questions, and thanks. Take care.
Sorry to those who wanted to ask a question. We've run out of we've run out of time. We apologize, but thank you for participating, and good night.